Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Carlson. I'm a senior in the Departments of Political Science and Legal Studies. Today, I'm going to be talking about the ideological roots of police militarization. So how very appropriate for Ken to be talking about media framing and the events in Ferguson. So it's a nice segue. So I'll start my presentation by showing this photograph. When do you think this was taken? Probably maybe 1960s, the 1970s. All of those would be excellent guesses. Actually, this was from the fall of 2014 at the University of California-Berkeley, which is no stranger to protests. Now, I want to show this photograph because I think it illustrates how pervasive and enduring the issue of police militarization has been, not just recently, but the past few decades, onwards from about the 1960s. And so, while a lot of people have focused on what have been like the policies and different events that have encouraged an increasingly militarized police force, I think there's been a lot less research and maybe a focus on what's actually encouraged those policies, or why are we trying to make law enforcement more like the military? And so that's what my research focused on. And from my research, I looked into this ideology of militarism, and it was kind of my hypothesis that it's this ideology, in fact, that has been a catalyst for police militarization in the United States. Talk about militarism per se, it's important to kind of talk about what has been the traditional roles of military and police as we've kind of known it through the last few centuries. So typically, the military has been used during times of war, used against foreign enemies. There's always exceptions to that, but that's usually been the role. And they're taught to use force to kill, and often indiscriminately, because that's what we need when we're fighting a war or we have a conflict. So the institution of law enforcement has kind of its own duties and set rules, and they've been kind of charged with enforcing the law domestically, so here. And ideally, they're supposed to be trained to enforce the law and keep the peace by the use of minimal force. Because keep in mind, police officers are interacting with everyday citizens like you or I, and we're not enemies, we're citizens here. And ideally, their role should be to protect life, to guard civil liberties. However, there's been kind of a conflation between these two roles, as I'm going to talk about, and that's because of militarism. Dr. Cynthia Brown defines militarism as the adoption of war and military behaviors as ideals. And it's an ideology that stresses the use of force and the threat of violence as the most appropriate and efficacious means to solve problems. So when we put that idea of militarism and the goals and the beliefs behind it into action, we get militarization. And what does militarization mean? Militarization means that it encompasses the manner in which society adopts those tenets of militarism. Historian Richard Cohn asserts that militarization is the degree to which a society's institutions, policies, behaviors, thought, and values are devoted to military power or shaped by war. So when we apply that to law enforcement, they're adopting these values and kind of looking to the goals of the military and the functions of the military in order to do their jobs. But it hasn't always been that way. Actually, in the beginning, if we go back to colonial America, those colonists were very used to having British soldiers on their streets being the ones to enforce the law. A lot of times they got in fights with colonists, and they even quartered themselves in their homes, and that's why we have the Third Amendment. But from this time, they had this idea that they didn't really like the idea of soldiers being the ones to enforce the law domestically. It caused a lot of problems. So when the time came for the beginnings of a police department in the 20th century, police departments were originally founded on what was called a preventive control model. So it kind of meant that the presence of a police officer itself should deter crime. You see a police officer, you're probably not going to break the law. During this time, police departments were highly decentralized and they favored democratic participation, and a lot of times it was local political leaders that kind of set the duties and the goals for the officers in those communities. So officers a lot of times have requirements that they had to live within the communities, so that gave them a chance to get to know their neighbors, get to know the businesses, and since they were kind of given their duties by elected officials, a lot of these duties revolved around service, things that would get these elected officials reelected. So during this time, we saw police officers even serving in soup kitchens and opening up the police department as a homeless shelter, like in the winter, so when it got cold, people had somewhere to go. So while this method was not perfect, it did kind of breed corruption and patronage, and there's many reactions and reforms to that. It was focused kind of on the community and kind of focused on this democratic participation model. And furthermore, police officers, since they worked in these communities, were able to police based on community standards. So they enforced some rules, they didn't enforce some other rules because they wanted to kind of look to what the community needed, what the community wanted. So they had a lot of discretion. And like I said, there was a lot of reforms to this. That wasn't a perfect model, but it was during the 1960s where we kind of saw a very big shift. And if we think about the 1960s, there was a lot of things going on. There were civil rights protests, anti-war movements, labor movements, mass shootings, and drug use. And a lot of lawmakers and law enforcement officials kind of saw many of these things as social ills and problems. They had issues with crowd control. They had issues with protests. And they wanted to kind of find a way to kind of fight these social ills, as a lot of them framed it. So how did they want to do that? Well, there was this idea of a fast-acting, military-like response force to fight these ills. So federal and state governments framed these issues as a shared enemy of American citizens that required extreme measures to fight. So kind of gearing up law enforcement with the tools of the military in order to kind of control these like protests, to control some of the issues, to control crime. And this kind of manifested itself through the creation of SWAT teams. Now, during this time period, specifically, Los Angeles was facing a lot of issues, a lot of like protests, a lot of mass riots, and police officers were facing things they had never faced before. There was snipers on rooftops, there was Molotov cocktails being tossed at them. So there's this idea that, like I mentioned, they needed to become more of like a military force, because back then they had to call in the National Guard or the Coast Guard to help assist them stop these riots. So they wanted to be able to do this internally. So the idea of SWAT teams came into fruition, and they were directly modeled after the military. Officers and groups were broken down into squads and platoons. And even if we look to the original kind of proposal for what would SWAT stand for, originally it was going to be Special Weapons Attack Team. Now, some law enforcement officials found the word attack to be inappropriate because, you're dealing with citizens. That's where we got the model, now kind of the modern acronym of Special Weapons and Tactics. And these SWAT teams began training with Marines on kind of military bases. They were outfitted with automatic weapons that were often reserved just for the military, and they began to find funding from the federal government. And the need for these teams, at least for lawmakers, would be justified by other events, such as the war on drugs. Even President Nixon requested new funding for kind of these paramilitary units, citing the need to wage a new all-out offensive. So new grants were offered to police departments to encourage them to use narcotic strike forces. So we can even see that military mindset being reflected in the language that is being used to describe kind of the issues they're facing. So we had a lot of crime bills that authorized law enforcement to utilize preventative detention, wiretapping, and no-knock raids. Nixon wouldn't be kind of the last person to do this. We saw a lot of other evolutions throughout the Reagan years, throughout the Clinton years, where the Pentagon would offer new grants, different law enforcement agencies would receive surplus military gear that was from the Pentagon, from the Department of Defense. And September 11th kind of further catalyzed that, because now police officers were being recruited to kind of assist in the war on terror. So even when we look at that, you're kind of framing them into kind of a military mindset, because they're kind of being recruited as soldiers in this. And from this time, we saw new grants and new funding available from the Department of Homeland Security. Now, this is kind of a little, why is this a problem? Well, this is a problem for a lot of reasons. And when we have a conflation of the roles of the military and police, one of the side effects we get is a socialization of danger. So this kind of is like a phenomenon that when there's this idea that there's a protracted military crisis, when you have more police officers looking like military members, responding like military members, that there's a crisis going on. So instead of valuing things like independence, dissent, freedom, all good values, those values begin to kind of be replaced by, authority, obedience, service, because, you may not want to be as creative or expressive if you're afraid that you may be kind of, subject to police brutality or something. And we've also seen issues with the use of SWAT teams. These are just some figures from the ACLU that, although they're supposed to be used for very kind of active shooter situations or barricade situations, 79% of the time they're used for executing search warrants now. And law enforcement is increasingly kind of adopting this mindset themselves. In a survey conducted by Prescott and Kapler, 63% of law enforcement officials responded that paramilitary policing units play an important role in community policing strategies. So we see that law enforcement is now kind of adopting this identity as well. It's also kind of problematic for already strained relationships between law enforcement and different communities, including people of color and lower income individuals, because Daryl Meeks argues that this military mindset kind of encourages law enforcement to look at people as enemies, so often looking at people of color or lower income individuals as enemies, and kind of like the urban environment which they're working in as a war zone, instead of as like a community which they're serving. So just to conclude, militarism has kind of been the driving force for this conflation of roles of the military and law enforcement is kind of increasingly adopting this view. And this is problematic for a lot of reasons. So with that, I'll conclude. I'll take any questions.
And we do have some time for questions if anyone has any.
Yes.
Did you look into the funding that's poured in necessarily? Like how
yes.
much?
I mean, there's a lot from different figures, but like some of them I have on hand, like talking about that since the Clinton administration, there's been $4 billion of surplus military equipment that's been transferred from Middle Eastern war zones to different kind of police departments in America. And there's a lot of different ones depending on like the figures. I kind of break them down in my paper based on like what are the materials that are coming from the Pentagon, some come from Department of Homeland Security. So there are a lot of different kind of venues of funding. And I'm sorry I don't have all those numbers on hand, but they've been documented very profusely. And the ACLU actually has a lot of really good reports on that if you're interested. Yes.
Interesting talk. Historically, it's very interesting. I was wondering if you had looked at the efficacy of like neighborhood watches and community watch groups and community policing as opposed to, to try to counteract a little bit of what you were talking about.
My research didn't really kind of take me in that direction, but kind of you mentioning it, I think that would be kind of an interesting way to look at it, because that would be almost kind of like a return to kind of that community-based policing methods, kind of the preventive control model, which a lot of law enforcement were founded on. But unfortunately, I didn't really look into how maybe community watch groups were kind of functioning, or how they maybe have acted in relation to this kind of increased militarization. But yes.
I gotta ask, what's your opinion necessarily on the whole thing? And then do you feel that it's reversible in any real way?
I care a lot about this. I come from a law enforcement family, and I've seen kind of how a lot of increased kind of militarization has kind of taken law enforcement away from communities. It's kind of encouraged them to use excessive force in areas where, they can be trained to solve these with less force, with minimal force. So I care about this a lot because I care about law enforcement, I care about civil liberties, and I care about, people in these communities, everyday people who may be subject to this. So I think that, there needs to kind of, the militarization that's been going on needs to kind of stop. It needs to be, the ideology itself, where police officers are trying, or law enforcement itself as an institution is trying to become more like the military, that should be kind of stopped, and it has to be kind of returned to a service model and like a community model. And I think it's reversible, but I think it's going to have to take a lot of work, and it's not an easy goal. And I think that we've seen a lot more attention drawn to this issue, and the big, I think the biggest things that we can do to kind of combat it is kind of on the federal level, like stop these grants, stop providing the money, stop providing the weapons, and if you cut that off, I think that would help. But it's a big job. It's not easy. It's happened over 40 or 50 years. It may take that long to reverse it, so I would like to hope it is.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you.